Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you also for that introduction. My name is Jason Cober. I'm the lead project manager in the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion. And today we're going to be talking about a group submission of promotional materials in eCTD format. This is a submission type that we frequently receive questions on. It's not a new submission type. We've been accepting group submissions of the 2253 in particular for several years now, but we receive a lot of questions about how to submit these submission types in eCTD format. So we thought this presentation would be a good opportunity for us to present to our submitters and explain some of the details around group submissions in eCTD format. Before we continue, I just want to point out that the scope of this presentation will be limited to promotional materials submitted to OPDP. So if you're looking for guidance on how to submit group submissions for, say, O&D or CDER, that content will fall outside the scope of this presentation. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? So first of all, I'm going to start by providing some background on group submissions. We'll talk a little bit about what's contained in the electronic submissions guidance for promotional materials. We'll talk a little bit about how group submissions work functionally, and then we'll go into the details of what the guidance says a group submission is. Very importantly, we're going to talk about the eCTD structure of a group submission, because the eCTD structure in the U.S. regional file is really what drives the group functionality. And it's important to make sure that we understand how to structure our U.S. regional file to ensure that a group submission is processed correctly. We'll spend some time talking about the contents of a group submission. We're going to talk about what files should accompany a group submission for both a 2253 and a new non-2253 group submission. And then finally, we're going to spend some time talking about common errors related to group submissions. Okay, so some background. On June 24th, 2019, the FDA published final guidance titled Providing Regulatory Submissions in Electronic and Non-Electronic Format, Promotional Labeling and Advertising Materials for Human Prescription Drugs. And this guidance describes the structure and the format for promotional submissions in eCTD format. Group submissions in particular are discussed in section 6J of the guidance. Now, most of the content that I'm going to talk about today is going to be sourced from the final guidance, but we will point to a couple different documents which I've listed in the resources section. But most of the information that I'm going to discuss will come from the promotional labeling and advertising electronic submissions guidance. So if you haven't already familiarize yourself with the guidance, I would strongly encourage you to, but I suspect most people are already familiar with it if they're attending this webinar. So before we talk about what a group submission is, I think it's helpful to understand how a group submission works. Simply put, when a submitter submits a group submission, the contents of the group submission are distributed to all member applications in a group. But how does that work functionally, and how does that work behind the scenes? And I think when we talk about any kind of technical function, tends to be a black box type issue here, where we don't always understand what's going on behind the scenes. So when you upload something in eCTD to the gateway, it's not always clear what happens after your submission gets uploaded. As I said earlier, this isn't a new process for OPDP. We've accepted 2253s as group submissions in paper format. But I found that in my experience with group submissions, it's helpful to explain the paper submission process first, and then how that translates to the electronic submission. I don't know if it's because it's easier to follow a process when there's a tangible piece of paper to follow through the process, but I found that when trying to explain how a group submission works, it's helpful to explain how this worked in paper. So prior to the eCTD mandate for 2253s, we would receive a typical 2253 group submission, and that would contain something like a completed 2253. It would have a supplemental application list attached, and that was the additional applications that were in the group that were not listed on the 2253. It would contain all of the PI for all of the member applications. And in most cases, the 2253 would have a CD or a USB drive attached that contained digital copies of the promotional materials. But in some cases, too, it would include paper copies of the promotional materials. So when this came in paper, generally it was delivered via FedEx, UPS, Postal Service, courier, some kind of delivery service, and we had a document room technician who would open it up, look at the file, and they would create a submission record in our system for the 2253. Once the submission record was created, it was then added under each application that was listed on the supplemental application list. So a record was effectively created under each application that was listed in the submission. From there, the technician would upload the contents of the CD, the USB drive, or they would scan in the paper copies and upload those files to a single shared location. And then they would add that shared location path to each of the submission records. So effectively, what we're talking about here is a single record created under each application, but the file path, or at least in this case, the single physical file, was distributed to each application in the group. And when we talk about eCTD and we talk about electronic submission of group submissions, the process really isn't a whole lot different. It's very identical to the way that we handled this in paper, except when a submission is coded properly in the US regional file, there's no document room technician coding. There's no human intervention. There's no person who's actually going in and conducting any kind of coding behind the scenes. All the information is contained in your US regional XML file, and we have an automated system that reads, it parses the data out of the XML file and conducts the same processing that the technician would have conducted and basically recreates the exact same process. So this is a very simplistic way to explain what's going on behind the scenes. There's a lot more that goes into this. There's a lot of QC checks. There's a lot more processing that goes on. So this isn't the only thing that happens, but I think from a high level that kind of illustrates how the group submission process works, because we do get questions a lot about how does this actually work, and how does a single submission get distributed across multiple applications. Now, when we are talking about eCTD, there are a few other requirements. So, as I said, we do create a record under each application that you list in your US regional file. But when we're talking about eCTD, one of the key differences between the paper submissions is that we require a sequence number for each member application. So that sequence number needs to be submitted in the US regional file, and we need that to create the submission record in our tracking system. And then, as I said, once you upload your file, when you upload that to the electronic submissions gateway, eventually your single file makes it to a shared location on a server, and the path is then added to each of those submission records. So it's still one submission that has been distributed to multiple applications. Occasionally we get questions. We used to get this more when we were getting paper copies. Submitters would ask us, are you making photocopies of our submission? You know, they would submit a 2253. It would list, say, 10 applications. It would have a couple materials, and they would ask if we're making photocopies of their promotional materials and then distributing them to 10 applications. But as you can imagine, that would entail quite a bit of work, and with things being stored digitally, there really isn't a need to make photocopies. We simply upload things to a single shared location and then distribute that path to that shared location to all of the records that would reference this particular submission. And if you're wondering what a reviewer in OPDP would see when they go into our tracking system, the reviewer is going to see a single submission that's linked to multiple applications. So they'll see your 2253, they'll see the accompanying promotional materials, and then they'll also see the links in our system that indicate that that one 2253 has been linked to multiple applications. So I hope that gives you some context on how this works, because I think having that context will help better explain what we're going to talk next when we talk about the more technical aspects of a group submission. Okay, so what is a group submission? As I said, our electronic submissions guidance has a definition for what a group submission is, and simply put, a group submission is a single submission in eCTD format. But more importantly, it contains promotional materials that promote more than one product. This is very important because in order to use the group functionality, your promotional materials have to promote all of the members of the group. The group submission has to contain the current labeling for each promoted product, and if we're talking about a grouped accelerated approval or advisory submission, you can use draft labeling, assuming you don't have a final label at that point. But generally speaking, when we're talking about the 2253, it has to include all of the current labeling for each member in the group. And finally, this is specific to eCTD, promoted products must be of the same application type. So if you have a set of promoted products that are not the same application type, say maybe a couple NDAs and a couple BLAs, those materials will have to be submitted separately because the group submission can only contain applications of the same application type. And you can do that either by submitting single product submissions, or you can group submissions batched by application type. So if you can bear with me for the next couple slides, we're going to talk a little technical here. So there's a few technical considerations to take into account, but this is very important because as I mentioned when we were talking about the paper process, as I said, when a document room technician handled a paper submission, they created a group based on the application that was listed in on the 2253 and then in your supplemental application list. That was the mechanism for communicating to the FDA that these are the members of the group. It was the information on the 2253 and the additional applications listed on the supplemental application list. When we're talking about eCTD now, the key distinction is the use of the U.S. regional file to communicate that information. So if you're going to put a 2253 together that is a group submission, you'll do the same structuring. You'll include a 2253. It'll have an application listed on it. You'll have a supplemental application list that's included with the 2253. But in order to communicate that this is a group in eCTD format, you'll have to make sure that the U.S. regional file is constructed correctly. And what that means is that the U.S. regional file must include all member applications in the application set section. Additionally, each member application must include a sequence number. Okay, so that sequence number must be unique to the respective application. It must not have been previously submitted under its respective application. And if any group submission includes an application number and sequence number combination that has been previously submitted, the entire group will be rejected. Okay, so next I want to talk about some specifics related to the XML component. Within the U.S. regional file, there's an application set section, and that application set section can contain one or multiple application elements. And this is really the driver behind the group submission functionality. When an application set only contains a single application element, that tells the system that this is a single product submission. When there's multiple application elements in the application set section, then this tells our system that you're submitting a group submission. Within the application element section, each element contains an attribute called the application containing files attribute. And this is how we indicate to the system which application is the lead application and which applications are the non-lead members. So when you submit a group submission, you'll submit the first application with the application containing files attribute of true, and this will indicate to the system that this is the lead application. It's important also to note that the lead application should match the application that's listed on the 2253. When the application containing files attribute is set to false, this tells the system that these are the non-lead members, or rather, these are the applications that you're listing on your supplemental application list. So this is basically how the system can tell which application to upload the files to and which applications are members to simply associate to these submissions. The lead application should be listed first in the application section. And a group submission can only contain one lead application. So let's take a look at an example. So we've pulled a sample XML file here, and we've applied formatting to make it easier to read. But this is how a properly structured application set would look. In this situation, what we're looking at is a group submission that contains 3 applications. And what's important to point out here is, first, our application containing files attribute is set to true on the first application. So this is our lead application. And then the 2 member applications have their application containing file attribute set to false. Okay, so this is the correct configuration for the application containing file attribute. Next, you'll notice that there's 3 applications in the application group, and each one is the same application type. We have 3 NDAs in this application set. Finally, each application has a unique sequence number, and that sequence number is unique to that particular application. And again, this is very important because we do see cases where submitters will propagate the same sequence number from the lead to all of the members. So for example, sometimes we see a submitter give us a group submission, and the lead will say sequence 17, and they'll use sequence 17 in the member applications. And again, that's probably the most common scenario where we see a rejection because there's a non-unique sequence error that causes the group to get rejected. So it's important to remember when you're creating a group submission, the sequence number has to be unique to the application number that it's affiliated with. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about are group submission contents. So we're going to focus a good bit of time on the 2253 because that's the most common submission type that we see for group submissions. So a group submission for 2253s has the same required submission contents as a single product 2253. You have to have a completed FDA Form 2253, the current PI for all members of the group, and a clean copy of the promotional materials. For the Form FDA 2253, as I said earlier, the application listed as the lead application in the U.S. regional file should match the application listed on the Form FDA 2253. The Form FDA 2253 should also indicate that it is a multi-product submission. The non-lead members of the group should be listed on a separate supplemental application list, and this supplemental application list should include the application type and number, the product name, and the date and the file name of the current PI. When you submit your supplemental application list, you want to make sure that you submit that in the same section as the completed Form FDA 2253. And again, we're showing another example from a sample XML file. And what we're looking at here is an excerpt from the form section of the US regional file. And what we have in this particular example, first we have the Form 2253 itself. It's placed immediately in the form section. And then here right below it is the additional applications list or the supplemental applications list. So as I said earlier, you're going to attach your supplemental application list as a separate PDF file, but it will go in the same form section as the completed 2253. All right, next we're going to talk about the 2253 labeling. So group 2253 must be accompanied by the current product labeling for each member of the group. The labeling must be placed under heading 1.14.6. Submitters may submit a separate PDF copy of each label under 1.14.6. Alternatively, though, if you do not want to submit a PDF copy and you've previously submitted a copy of the current product label, you can use a cross-reference in section 1.14.6. So either option is acceptable. You can either send us a PDF copy of each label, or you can use a cross-reference to a previously submitted copy of the label, assuming that the cross-reference is going to the product label that's current for the reference product. So again, we're going to look at the XML here. What we're seeing is section 1.14.6. This is the product labeling for 2253 submissions. And again, if you recall, our example that we've been referring to in this presentation includes 3 separate products. And what we see here are 3 separate PIs. So these are new PDFs. It's 1 PI for each for one product. And what we see here is we have the product name. We have a clear indication that's a PI, and then we have the revision date in the PI's file name. And these should actually match what's listed both on the 2253 and your supplemental application list. Finally, for 2253 materials, we only need 1 set of materials under section 1.15.2. We do get this question occasionally. Submitters will ask, do they need to submit a copy of the materials for each member of the group? You do not, because as I said earlier, whatever you submit under 1.15.2 is going to get distributed to each member of the group. So if you send us a group with 10 applications in it, you only need to give us 1 copy of those materials. Those materials will get distributed to all 10 applications. It's not necessary to send us 10 different copies of the same material. Each material, as I said, that's included in the group will be linked to all members of the group. And just to wrap up our example of this particular XML, you can see here what we have is a product price catalog, and it's listed under section 1.15.2. And of course, there's only 1 copy of that material. And that material will then get distributed to each of the 3 applications that are listed in the application set section that we looked at earlier. Let's talk a little bit about non-2253 group submissions. So when you're submitting to non-2253s, this is anything that's going to go into section 1.15, the various cover letter headings. You only need to submit 1 cover letter, but it should be placed under the appropriate cover letter heading. The cover letter should also include a list of all member applications. So you want to make sure that you include the application type and the number and the product name. It's not necessary to include a supplemental application list if the cover letter lists all members of the group. So if you're able to, what we see sometimes in a cover letter is a table that lists out the application type, number, and product name in the cover letter. That's perfectly acceptable. And if that's what you do, or if you have a list on the last page of the cover letter that lists out the application type and number and the product name of the members, that's perfectly acceptable too. If you have included your application list somewhere in the cover letter, it's not necessary to include a supplemental application list with your cover letter. Finally, the subject line should reference the lead application number, and it should clearly identify the submission as a group submission. All right, so let's talk about some common errors. So these are things that we've seen over the last several years. I think we started receiving group submissions in eCTD somewhere around 2015. So we're going to talk about the errors that we've seen over the last several years, and we'll talk about the frequency of these errors and how you can avoid them. Okay, so the first common error is what I refer to as batched materials. And batch materials are when a company or submitter submits promotional materials for multiple products when the materials do not promote all members of the group. So if you recall, one of the important factors or one of the important requirements of a group submission is that all of the materials in a group submission have to promote all of the products in the group. So if this setup seems like an algebra equation, just bear with me for a few minutes. So first of all, let's imagine a scenario where there's a group 2253 that contains 3 member applications, and they're accompanied by 15 promotional materials. 5 materials promote product A, 5 materials promote product B, and the final 5 materials promote product C. None of the materials, though, promote products A, B, and C. And this is what we refer to as batched materials. It's basically promotional materials for different products that don't cross-promote any of those products. In this situation, as I said earlier, the promotional materials have to promote all products listed in the group. But if we see something like this happening, we'll contact the submitter and we'll ask them to resubmit the materials as single product submissions. Because as we say, the products in a group submission, the promotional materials in a group submission have to promote all of the products that are listed in the group. The next thing I want to talk about are application references. And I know I've been going on quite a bit about the application set section of the US regional file, but this is a common error that we see, and this is where a submitter uses application references instead of creating an application set in the US regional file. When you use the references section of the US regional file, it actually doesn't create a group submission. What that's actually doing in our system is the references create links between the applications, but the references do not require or include a sequence number. So therefore, just attaching references, it doesn't distribute the submission to the referenced applications. So again, this is something that I don't think we see it too often. We used to see it quite frequently. The way this would appear to us is we would get a 2253, we would open it up, it would have a application listed on the 2253. It would indicate that's a multi-product 2253. There would be a supplemental application list. There would be multiple PIs, one PI for each listed member of the group. But when we got into the US regional file, what we would see in the application information is a series of cross-references as opposed to different multiple application elements for each member of the group. So in these situations, we would contact the submitter. We would let them know that we can see that they clearly intended to submit a group submission, but they've used cross-references instead of the application set. So usually in that situation, we'll provide instructions to correct the submission. We'll ask them to withdraw the 2253 and submit a corrected one that uses the application set as opposed to using cross-references. As I said, we don't see this one too much any longer, but we did see that during the transition period as companies were transitioning to eCTD. But again, it's an important error that is you should be mindful of, and just understand that using cross-references in an application element is not going to create a group. There's no sequence number included in this cross-reference section, and it doesn't distribute the submission files to any of the applications that are cross-referenced. Something else that we see is what we call basically missing additional applications. It's very similar to the common error that we were just talking about, but it's a little bit different. So what we're talking about here is when you have a single product submission that is structured as a group submission. So this is a submission that includes all files required for a group submission, and the 2253 indicates that it's a multi-product submission. The US regional XML file, though, indicates that it's a single product submission, and we know this because we go into the application set section and we see only one application listed. So again, we open up a 2253, there's a application listed on the 2253, there's a supplemental application list, we have multiple PI, so we clearly know that the company intended to submit a group submission, but when we look at the US regional file, there's only a single product listed in the US regional file. In these kind of situations, we contact the sponsor, we let them know that we see that they intended to submit a group, but it isn't, the submission files aren't being distributed to the members listed on the application. So in these cases, we'll ask them to withdraw the 2253 and submit with a corrected US regional file. So the reason we do this is the submission is only processed using the data included in the US regional file. So if you send us a US regional file that only lists a single application, even if the submission contents, the 2253, the supplemental application lists the PIs, even if it's clear that it is a group submission, if the US regional file doesn't include the additional applications, we're not able to process it as a group submission. And the reason is that we can't add those additional applications if they're not listed in the US regional file. So even though you've provided a supplemental application list, if a group is submitted in eCTD format and it's clearly a group based on the 2253 and the accompanying materials, but the US regional file doesn't align and only provides one application, we can't process it as a group. So in most cases, when we open it up, we see the file is structured in this way. we will contact the submitter. We'll provide instructions for correcting, and usually we suggest that they withdraw the 2253 and resubmit when it's coded using the additional applications. And the final common error that we see is basically a single product submission that is structured as a group submission. Again, this is probably the least frequent of the errors, but to give you basically a description of how this appears to us, it's going to be a submission that includes all the files required for a group. The 2253 indicates that it's a multi-product submission. Once again, the U.S. regional file indicates that the submission is a single product submission. But in this case, it's the same submission being submitted multiple times. So let's say that we open up the 2253, there's a supplemental application list. There's a total of 10 applications in the group. And when we look up each application, we see the same submission submitted 10 times. The only thing that is being changed is the application number that's listed in the US regional file. Exact same submission, just submitted to us 10 times. Again, we don't see it too frequently. When we've called the sponsors, generally it's been a misunderstanding. We actually have seen this, and when we call the sponsor or the submitter, it's simply that they thought they needed to submit a group in this manner, and that we would do the linking behind the scenes. So they would submit the same submission 10 times, and then our system would go back and kind of join everything behind the scenes. But that's actually not the case. So as I mentioned earlier, when you populate the additional application section of the US regional file, that communicates to our system that it's a group, and there's no processing really done to kind of group single submissions. So just keep in mind, when you create a group submission, you have to have multiple applications in that application set section, and if you submit the same file multiple times individually, we're going to contact the submitter and we will ask them to withdraw it, because the important thing to remember is the content files need to match what's in the US regional file. So if your US regional file indicates that this is a single product submission, the 2253 also needs to match. It needs to indicate that it's a single product submission. There should only be one application listed. There should not be a supplemental application list, and there should not be multiple PIs. And just to wrap up in this this particular common error, what this appears to the reviewer is that it's a group submission submitted separately to multiple applications. And like I said, this doesn't happen too frequently, but we do see this, and it's generally just a misunderstanding related to how group submissions are processed. So I just want to wrap up by talking about the test submission process. One of the things that we strongly recommend, we really encourage submitters to take advantage of our test submission process. And the test submission process in OPDP provides submitters with an opportunity to validate your eCTD submission structure prior to submitting in the production environment. So if you haven't submitted a group submission before, we strongly encourage you to take advantage of the test submission process. The way this works is that the OPDP project management team will review the structure of the submission and then provide feedback. If there's anything wrong, if there's any corrections needed, we'll also contact you and provide instructions for making those corrections. So how does the test submission process work? So first of all, we have a lot of content on the OPDP eCTD webpage. We have several presentations. Eventually this presentation will also be posted there. If you have any questions, we ask that you prepare them in advance, and we're happy to answer them. But if you have any questions that haven't been answered by any of the content that's already posted, feel free to document those. We're happy to help out and provide any clarifications. When you're ready to submit a test file, we ask that you contact the OPDP eCTD mailbox and send the following items. You may or may not have all of these items, but if you have any questions that you want answered, please send those along so we can prepare responses. What type of submissions you would like to submit. So if you want to submit a group submission as a test submission, let us know. And if you have any kind of technical questions that you would like to discuss and you would prefer to have a 30-minute meeting with us as opposed to exchanging emails, let us know you'd like to meet and provide some availability. That'll be just dates and times that you and your team are available, and we'll try to accommodate. We're generally pretty flexible with our time, so it's just helpful if you let us know. If you'd like to meet with us, just give us some availability as well, and we can usually find time to meet. If you'd like to meet, like I said, we'll schedule a planning meeting. We'll provide answers during that meeting, and then we'll also talk through what kind of test cases you want to do. So if you want to do a group submission, we'll kind of talk you through that and answer any questions as far as how to structure that and provide specifics. When you do submit your test files, we ask that you notify the eCTD mailbox again. Let us know the results, whether it was accepted or rejected. And we also ask that you provide the core ID, because we're going to need that to go pull your file and review it. After we review your test submissions, we'll provide feedback and answer any questions that may have come up in the process. So I just want to wrap up here. We have a lot of resources that are available. We have links here. Some of these are specific to OPDP's eCTD content, and then there's some other content that we have that is related to CDER's broader eCTD team. There's a lot of content here. All the information that I talked about today was either sourced from the electronic submissions guidance or the content that's linked here. So if you have any questions about where the information from today's presentation came from, all the information is going to be somewhere in one of these links. And with that said, we'll go into the Q&A session.
Thank you, Jason, for the very informative presentation. We are now going to transition into our Q&A session. So it looks like we've received a lot of great questions so far, but if you have not had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We will plan to answer as many questions as time allows. So for our first question, if a sponsor submits a grouped promotional submission, do they have to continue to submit as a group?
Thanks, Renu. I think that's a really good question. When it comes to promotional submissions that are being grouped, there's no requirement to continue to submit as a group submission. So, for example, if you were to submit a 2253 with 5 applications in it, a few weeks later you submit another 2253, there's no requirement to continue to group those same 5 applications in the 2253. So just because you've submitted one group submission previously doesn't mean that you have to continue to submit those materials as a group going forward. If you want to separate them into individual submissions, or if you want to drop out certain products from the group, you can do that in future submissions.
Thanks, Jason. What should a sponsor do to ungroup a divested product that has previously been submitted as a member of a group promotional submission?
Thanks. That's a real good question too, and this is something that we get questions on frequently. So let's say you've again, we'll go back to a 2253 example. The 2253 has 5 applications. It's being submitted as a group with 5 applications. But let's say the company spins off one of those products, they sell it, or they just discontinue the product. Whatever the reason may be, going forward, there's really not a whole lot of work that you have to do with that 2253 with the divestiture. It's really just a matter of dropping that product from your future 2253 submissions. The one thing you do want to be mindful of, though, is if you are using any kind of reference link, so if you have PDF references anywhere in your XML file, just make sure that they're not pointed back to the dossier for your product that's been divested or discontinued. You want to make sure that those go to any of the products that you are continuing to maintain.
Okay. If a product is a biologic but managed officially by CDER, can these products be part of an NDA group submission?
Thanks. That's a good clarification. So as I said earlier in the presentation, when you're submitting an eCTD format, your group submissions have to be all of the same application type. So they have to be all NDAs or all BLAs. And if you have a BLA that's being reviewed by CDER, even though the BLA is still being reviewed by CDER, it would have to be submitted separately. So if you have multiple BLAs being reviewed by CDER, you can put those together in a group. But if you have a mix of NDAs and BLAs, even if the BLAs are being reviewed by CDER, you'll still have to separate those out because the group submissions are going to be limited to one application type per group.
And in order to submit a group submission, all applications must be in the new DTD 3.2, correct? Or is it just the lead application that has to be in the new DTD 3.2?
Yeah, so it's actually going to be DTD 3.3 or higher. The previous version of the DTD, I believe it was 2.0, didn't support promotional submissions. So if you're going to submit a group to OPDP, you'll have to use DTD version 3.3 or higher. Now, whether you're submitting the lead or a member, it's all going to be in the same US regional file. So presumably you would be using the same DTD format or the same DTD file for all of your US regional file. But it does need to be in DTD version 3.3 or higher.
Thank you. Within the application containing files section, how do we determine the lead application? Is it lowest to highest? Is it the lowest to highest application number? So the lower number would contain files to be listed on FDA forms?
Thanks. Yeah, so as far as identifying a lead, that's really at the discretion of the submitter. The submitter can determine whichever application they want to indicate as the lead application. It doesn't have to be submitted in sequential order, but the lead is designated by the submitter themselves, so you can specify any application as your lead application. Just keep in mind, whichever application you identify as the lead application in the US regional file should also match the application that you list on the form FDA 2253.
Great, thanks. Next question, can grouped promotional submissions be submitted through the CDER Next Gen portal?
So another good question. And I'm going to kind of double this up with another question that we received about what is allowed and what isn't allowed through the Next Gen portal. So if you're familiar with submissions to OPDP, you know that until June 24th of 2021, we were accepting all promotional submissions through the CDER Next Gen portal. We started accepting them that way starting March of 2020, and that was primarily in response to the pandemic. We wanted to give submitters who hadn't converted to eCTD yet an electronic pathway to submit. So if you're familiar with the OPDP electronic submissions guidance, you would see in the background section of the guidance is section 2 of the guidance, and really it starts at line 57. All of our electronic submissions guidances that are being published through the agency are tied to section 745A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. OPDP's electronic submissions guidance was published in final format on June 24th of 2019. And the guidance says that when that final guidance was published, that started a 24-month transition period. So this is where the June 24th date comes from. So effective June 24th, 2021, which was the expiration of that 24-month transition period for submitters to begin using eCTD. On June 24th of 2021, the Form FDA 2253 and the pre-submission of draft promotional materials for accelerated approval products could only be submitted in eCTD format through the electronic submissions gateway. And that's why you'll see effective June 24th of 2021, 2253s and accelerated approval submissions were no longer accepted through the CDER Next Gen portal. So there was a 24-month lead up to give submitters the opportunity to transition to eCTD. Now, with that said, outside of the 2253 and the pre-submission of accelerated approval draft materials, you can continue to submit through the CDER Next Gen portal. So if you wanted to submit, say, an advisory as a group submission through the CDER Next Gen portal, that's perfectly acceptable. The only thing you can't do is submit group 2253s or grouped accelerated approval submissions through the CDER Next Gen portal. And like I said, that just all goes back to the information that we have in the OPDP electronic submissions guidance. June 24th of 2021 was our deadline to transition to eCTD, and that's why, effective that date, we turned off the functionality to allow 2253 submissions and accelerated approval submissions through the NextGen portal. Outside of that, if you want to submit a group, say an advisory as a group through the NextGen portal, that's perfectly acceptable.
Thanks for that detailed explanation. Next question. As publishers, would we need to explain the possible risks associated with the sponsor if one of their dossiers were sold? There could be some submissions that were part of group submissions, so no actual documents would have been provided, at least in the actual eCTD exports.
So I can't really speak to the kind of discussions that have to go on between the firms when a product is sold or spun off to another company. What I can say is that there is certain information that you want to convey to those companies. It is helpful to let them know what you have previously submitted within a group submission. But I think what is really important for those firms to know are the sequence numbers that you've used. Because if you hand over a product or you sell a product and you're transitioning the submission process to another firm, they're going to need to know what sequences you've used in your submission process, because they won't be able to reuse those sequences. So it's really important to make sure that when you do transfer a product to another firm or another company, that you do let them know which sequences you've already used. Because if they try to use those sequences again, that will result in a rejection.
Thanks. Next question. As you can imagine, when preparing for a multi-product submission, many other submissions are taking place at the same time that use sequence numbers. This makes it difficult to know ahead of time which sequence numbers to reserve for the group submission. In addition, group submissions often get canceled or postponed. This causes submissions to be skipped or submitted out of order. Can you confirm that skipped sequence numbers or sequence numbers out of order is not an issue?
Thanks. Good question. It isn't an issue, and I completely acknowledge that there can be delays in the construction and the filing of your promotional submission. So it is possible that a later sequence number might get submitted while you're still in the process of putting an earlier sequence together. The only validation we have that you have to watch out for is that you don't reuse a sequence number. So as long as your document management process identifies which sequence is still in development and you don't submit duplicate sequence numbers, you should be good to go. But as far as the order of sequences, there's no restriction on that at this point.
Okay, next, could you explain in detail about supplemental applications and its content that goes along with the 2253? An example would be great.
Sure. So I can't share my screen right now, but I do want to refer you to the Form 2253. And when we talk about the supplemental application list, the instructions for this are actually derived exactly from the 2253 form itself. On the current version of the 2253, you would refer to box 2. The previous version, this would have been box 3. Whichever version you're using, you want to refer to one of those two boxes. I'm going to say that the current version that we have up there right now, that's box 2. There's a set of instructions in that box. And what it says is, for multiple products, submit completed form and specimen of advertising materials to one application of choice, and that's going to be your lead application. And then attach a separate sheet addressing items 3 through 5 for the remainder of the products. Now, when it says items 3 through 5, what it's referring to are the boxes on the Form 2253. So what we ask you to include on your supplemental application list is the application type and number, and then also give us the proprietary name, the established name, And the 2253 says the package insert date and the ID number. This is really the name of the file that you're putting in your US regional file. So it tells us what you've named your accompanying PI. So if you're not sure what to include on your supplemental application list, you can refer to the form 2253. On the current version of the form, those instructions are in box 2, and that will tell you everything that you should include on your supplemental application list.
Great, thanks. Our next question, regarding social media two-way platforms, could a company submit both professional and consumer on one social media report and on the same 2253 form? If yes, then which audience would we choose on the form?
Thanks. So what the guidance tells us is that, and this again goes back to the form 2253, you should submit your promotional materials separated by audience type, either HCP or consumer. And that goes back to, again, the 2253. There's a box on the 2253, and the current version, it's box 7A. And that asks you to identify either professional materials or consumer materials. So we do ask you to separate promotional materials by audience type, either consumer or professional. Now, with that said, we acknowledge that there are going to be certain cases where you have a promotional material that is going to be targeted at both audiences. In situations where it's clearly one audience type or the other, so it's either clearly consumer or clearly professional, we ask you to separate those and submit those in separate submissions. And you can do that as a group, so you can do separate group submissions. If you have a situation where you have a broad promotional piece that could be targeted at both consumers and professional, in that situation, we ask you to identify it as the broadest audience type. So if it's both consumer and professional, say a website maybe, but it's mostly targeted at consumers, then identify it as a consumer. In that case, you can submit it as just one submission. But in most cases, you want to separate your submission type your submissions based on the audience type, either consumer or professional.
Thanks. Next, how are group submissions life-cycled if a promotional piece needs to be replaced?
Thanks. Yeah, I think we get questions on life cycles every time we do these presentations. So the life cycle operators are going to work exactly the same, whether you're doing a group submission or a single product submission. So if you want to do a life cycle replace, you can do that. So let's say you have a 2253. It's the first time you're running these promotional pieces. It's the first time you submit it on 2253. You would submit that as a group. You would put all of your materials in the materials section, and you would use the new operator. Let's say a few weeks, a few months down the line, you've revised those same materials, and now you want to update them via 2253. You can use the replace operator again on the group submission, and again the replace operator is going to prompt you for a reference back to your previous submission, and you can just point back to the materials that you submitted in that initial group. So the replace operator will work exactly the same as it does on a single product submission. I do want to respond to a question that we received beforehand, though, and I think this is something that we see occasionally too. As I understand it, there's at least one publishing tool out there that when the submitters use the replace operator, it inherits the metadata from the sequence that's being replaced, and there's no way to update that. When submitting to OPDP, our recommendation to submitters who encounter that issue is to simply use the new operator. So in situations where you have a publishing tool that is forcing you to inherit information from a replaced sequence, that does cause problems on our end because we need to see the most current information. So if you have one of these publishing tools that's causing that type of issue, we encourage you to just use the new operator. Absent that, if you want to use the replace operator, by all means, it'll work exactly the same as when you submit a single product submission.
Thanks, Jason. Next question. In a hypothetical situation where you are submitting material that promotes 4 products, 3 are BLAs and 1 is an NDA, would it be possible to submit a group submission for the 3 BLAs and then submit the 1 NDA separately, or does this material have to be submitted separately for each?
That's a really good question. As you've described it, yes, that's exactly how we recommend submitting that situation. So in the hypothetical scenario, we have 4 applications, 3 are NDAs, 1 is a BLA. What we recommend doing is batch your NDAs together, submit your 3 NDAs as a group, and then submit the 1 BLA as a single product submission. But with that said, if you would like to do 4 single product submissions, that's perfectly acceptable. There's no requirement to use the group function. But if you did want to try and cut down on your number of submissions, you could certainly group your 3 NDAs together and then submit the BLA separately. And now you only have to submit 2 submissions as opposed to 4.
And I think we have time for one more question. Could you please go over the process of withdrawing a submission if a sponsor makes an error? In other words, how does the sponsor withdraw a submission or application?
Yeah, so if you wanted to withdraw a group submission, in this case, it's really simple. What you would use is a cover letter, and the cover letter is going to describe the nature of the error. It's going to state that you would like to withdraw that particular submission. It should also state that whether or not you have disseminated those materials publicly or not. That cover letter will go under eCTD heading 1.15.1.9. And then you'll just make sure that in your additional applications section, you list all the additional applications that were listed for all of the members of the group that you want to withdraw. And what that will do is that will link that withdrawal request to all of the members in the group. But that would be the way to go about withdrawing a group submission.
Okay, so thanks, Jason, for responding to all of those great questions. We do have a few closing reminders. This activity is